Section 15 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abai in September 2010. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 15. Maria Theresa, Part 1. We will not from the helm to sit and weep, but keep our course, though the rough wind say, No. Shakespeare. Austria is a name that suggests the ideas of despotism, cruelty, and bigotry. In these respects it is a land that has no rival, except Russia. Every humane and free heart must burn with indignation at the mere mention of those empires. But Austria, however repulsive as a bloodthirsty power, has much attractive interest in its several provinces and noted places and in portions of its history. Bohemia, Moravia, and Hungary have associations that are dear to art, to religion, and to liberty. Austerlitz is a word of potent influence, and Vienna is full of picturesque imagery, for it is the name of a capital than which there is none more gay, magnificent, and enriched with curiosities. Not in any other town with statelier progress to and fro the double tides of chariots flow, by park and suburb, on the brown of lustier leaves, no more content or pleasure lives in any crowd, when all is gay with lamps and loud with sport and song in booth and tent, imperial halls or open plain, and wheels the circled dance, and breaks the rocket molten into flakes of crimson or in emerald rain. And as for the history of Austria, it would have enough charm if it only bore the noble name of Maria Theresa. In her we behold indeed some of the worst peculiarities of her royal line, but softened by her womanly nature and receiving from that nature many a balancing virtue. If her censorship of the press and espionage of private life were worthy of her detestable successors, her great and successful enterprises, military, educational, and industrial, and her reforms in church and state were worthy of her beauty, talent, and exalted character. Vienna was her birthplace, and her birthday the 13th of May, 1717. As usual, the royal child received a baptismal name proportioned in length to her imperial ancestry, and superfluous as her fortune. It was Maria Theresa Valperga Amelia Christina, a grand name, like a carriage of state with 6 horses. Nothing short of a family that, like Maria Theresa's, the House of Habsburg, had reigned 400 years, and had absorbed so many states and races into its vast empire, should justify such a parade of praenomenes. Her father, the Emperor Charles VI., was a man of dull perceptions and extraordinary gravity, very punctilious in all matters of form, and of a benevolent disposition. He labored to improve the condition of his dominions, rebuilt roads, encouraged commerce, manufactures, and art, revised the laws of Hungary, and established museums and libraries. He was fond of athletic sports, such as hunting and shooting at a mark, but his ruling passion was music. He composed an opera, and himself led the orchestra, while his daughters acted as ballet dancers. The costume and scenery of one of these exhibitions cost him over $130,000. From Italy he attracted to his court Metastasio, who composed some of his best operas at Vienna, and was Italian preceptor to the young princesses. But, in consequence of the imbecility of Charles and his advisers, his reign nearly ruined his empire. His best general, Prince Eugene, died, and his enemies made encroachments on every side. The English ambassador wrote home that, quote, "Everything in this court is running into the last confusion and ruin, where there are as visible signs of folly and madness as ever were inflicted on a people whom heaven is determined to destroy, no less by domestic divisions than by the more public calamities of repeated defeats, defenselessness, poverty, plague, and famine." End quote. The loss of Belgrade, surrendered by a treaty to the Turks, and the menacing conduct of the French, preyed on his spirits, undermined his health, and inflamed his ailments of gout and indigestion. With reckless imprudence, he insisted on taking a hunting excursion, and eat immoderately of mushrooms stewed in oil. This prostrated him beyond recovery. He took an affectionate leave of his family, and died in 1740, when Maria Theresa was 23 years of age. His wife was Elizabeth Christina, daughter of Louis Rodolphe, Duke of Brunswick. By her he was the father of a son, who died in infancy, and 3 daughters, one of whom died in childhood. The others were Maria Theresa, the eldest, and Maria Amelia. They married brothers, Francis, Duke of Lorraine, and Prince Charles of Lorraine. The latter, Maria Amelia's husband, was distinguished in the wars of Theresa's accession to the throne. The mother, like the daughters, was famed for beauty, elegant manners, and kind disposition. The sisters, who bore the title of archduchesses, were very unlike in their style of person, mind, and character. Equally fascinating, Maria Amelia had less intellect and confidence and brilliancy of feature. Maria Theresa was full of life and dignity. She seemed every way constituted for a queen. Her form was tall and well proportioned, her face regular, her eyes a bright gray, her complexion clear, her voice musical, and her bearing at once majestic and graceful. In her youth, her temper was sufficiently gentle and yielding, her heart overflowing with tenderness. It was not until she assumed the sceptre and found herself threatened on every side by hostile invasions that the unrelenting determination of her character was drawn forth, and indeed a degree of resoluteness was demanded that hardly differed from the obstinacy peculiar to her family blood. She was educated, after the manner of the age, more in feminine accomplishments than in the solid acquirements that would best fit her for a station of great authority. From her father she inherited a passion for music, which was carefully developed under her distinguished instructors, among whom was Metastasio. He took much pride in her proficiency, especially in the Italian language, and could not praise too highly her talent and gentleness. Happily, the family pride so assiduously nourished by the house of Habsburg induced in her a studious acquaintance with the history and condition of her expected empire, so that a foundation was laid for her able administration. At the same time, the seeds of her after bigotry were sown and cultivated by the 1,000 Romanish observances to which a great part of her time was set apart. It fostered, however, a strong religious inclination that might have made her a saint in the annals of a more enlightened creed than that of Rome. At the age of 14 she was required, as a matter of custom for the heir apparent to the crown, to be present at the meetings of the royal council. She had no share, of course, in the debates, but however long and tedious the sessions were, she always showed the liveliest interest in everything said, whether intelligible to her or not. The need of being well versed in affairs of state was apparently anticipated by her shrewd apprehension. The only part she was permitted to take in the proceedings was the offering of petitions, entrusted to her care. Her immature years and ready goodwill made her frequently subject to such applications, and when her father rebuked her with the words, "You seem to think a sovereign has nothing to do but to grant favors," she replied with a precocious wisdom, "I see nothing else that can make a crown supportable." At so early a period of life, she saw that her father's miseries were not outweighed by the empty shows of imperial grandeur. The young Francis, Duke of Lorraine, whose mother was a first cousin of the Emperor, had been brought up at the court of Vienna as the destined husband of Maria Theresa. From infancy they had associated together, and now, in youth, became more romantically devoted to each other. He had every quality to captivate her heart. Though not powerful or brilliant in mind, he was intelligent and kind, and he was brave, manly, accomplished, and remarkably handsome. When the Archduchess had reached the age of 18, her father's government was so much endangered by the triumphs of foes and the indifference of pledged friends, that he was urged to break up the proposed union with Francis, and give his daughter to Don Carlos of Spain, as a last resort to uphold his own power. The Spanish minister at his court recommended that both daughters be married to princes of Spain. But Maria Theresa, already betrothed, remonstrated so warmly that the emperor knew not what to do. In the words of the English minister, "She is a princess of the highest spirit. Her father's losses are her own. She reasons already, she enters into affairs, she admires his virtues, but condemns his mismanagement, and is of a temper so formed for rule and ambition as to look upon him as little more than her administrator. Notwithstanding this lofty humor by day, she sighs and pines all night for her Duke of Lorraine. If she sleeps, it is only to dream of him. If she wakes, it is but to talk of him to the lady in waiting, so that there is no more probability of her forgetting the very individual government, and the very individual husband which she thinks herself born to, than of her forgiving the authors of losing either." The empress joined her own to the entreaties of her daughter, the German ministers interfered in behalf of the duke, and the emperor, driven to sleepless distraction, finally yielded to the wish of his family, and strengthened his power by a treaty with his old enemy France, giving the Duchy of Bar and Francis' inheritance of Lorraine in exchange for Tuscany. Francis and Maria Theresa, thus saved from separation by her constancy and resolution, were married at Vienna in February 1736. 2 sweet children crowned this year's happiness. Blessed in these and in their own youth, beauty, love, and splendid position and prospects, nothing could exceed the brightness of their union. But the common lot of trouble was in store for them. The Duke was appointed to the command of an army set against the Turks in the first year of his marriage. He was courageous and often risked his life, but he was not a great and successful commander, and he was, moreover, fettered by the instructions of the court and by the lack of needed means. Victorious at first, the army suffered sad reverses and was weakened by pestilence. Francis returned to Vienna to meet the complaints of the emperor, the cold welcome of the powerful, the unjust contempt of the people, but to be greeted also by the warm sympathy of his wife, whose fear for his exposures was now changed to indignation at his treatment. Her father found it advisable to send her and the Duke to Tuscany, ostensibly to visit their new estates, and he talked of changing the heirship of the crown to his youngest daughter, and betrothing her to the Elector of Bavaria. All this was probably done to appease the popular feeling. At Florence, the young wife was very discontented. The climate was disagreeable to her more northern associations. She saw little to admire in the people, or the city and scenery. She was in continual distress about the misguided state of affairs at home, whereby her vast inheritance was rapidly dwindling. And Charles himself did not long manage to dispense with his daughter's clearer mind and firmer character. 4 years passed since her nuptials, when she was called to the throne by the death of her father, whose end was hastened by his repeated misfortunes. She was 23 when she thus began to enjoy the various titles of Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, Archduchess of Austria, Sovereign of the Netherlands, Duchess of Milan, of Parma and Placentia, and Grand Duchess of Tuscany, all of which honors are summed up in the one name of Empress of Austria. She swayed the scepter over various nations, with diverse languages and laws, and only held together by submission to one sovereign. It was the richest empire of Europe, but its treasury was drained, its armies scattered, its provinces disaffected, and on every side were greedy governments, to whom her accession was the signal to fall upon her dominions and divide them among themselves. The famous Pragmatic Sanction was to be broken by all. This was a treaty which it had been the labor of Charles' life to establish. By it, the European powers had guaranteed to support the claims of Maria Theresa to the imperial crown, instead of the daughters of Emperor Joseph, the predecessor and brother of Charles, and to whose family the succession should have reverted according to Charles' own solemn promise. These daughters had married, the eldest the Elector of Bavaria, the youngest, the Elector of Saxony. France, jealous of the ascendancy of Austria, with various false excuses, deferred to acknowledge Maria Theresa, and prepared to assist the pretensions of the Bavarian Elector, who claimed Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. The King of Spain made the same pretension, and set on foot an expedition against the Italian dependencies of the empire. The Sardinian king had his eye on Milan, and the King of Prussia, Frederick II., marched for Silesia before his designs were known at Vienna, and took possession of it. He proved to be the almost lifelong and very dangerous enemy of the Empress, although he entertained high personal respect for her character. His father, without engaging much in war, had made it his empty pride to discipline a vast standing army, amass money, and drill his son in military science. Frederick had resisted this stern schooling, and devoted himself passionately to literature and art. But, so soon as, about this time, he mounted the throne of his father, he suddenly revealed extraordinary ambition and skill as a politician and commander. Thus was the young and beautiful Maria Theresa, at the instant a diadem was placed on her head, called to take arms against the sea of troubles. Her own strong understanding and strong will were all that she could rely upon. Her husband was brave and tender, but with no talents nor disposition to assume the guidance of affairs. He was devoted to pleasure, and seems to have trusted more to his wife's intelligence and decision than to his own. The members of the State Council were weak men, who were confounded by the difficulties that beset them. Bartenstein, who was their chief, and had been under Charles, was a man of facile pen and tongue, faithful to his trust, but too shallow for his responsible position. England alone, although afterwards tardy in many of her engagements, was enthusiastic in favor of the Empress. The English ladies, indeed, subscribed some $450,000 in her aid. But she did not find it consistent to accept it, and, for the present, was virtually without allies, armies, councillors, and money. Never was a sky darker than hers. All who were around her expressed only despair in their countenances. The army that had been hastily raised to oppose the aggressions of Frederick was defeated by his troops in Silesia. The French, appealed to in remembrance of the pragmatic sanction by which they were bound, gave evasive answers, until they marched their forces across the Rhine, joined the Elector of Bavaria, subdued Bohemia, and approached the gates of Vienna itself. Still was Maria Theresa undaunted, although the crisis of her fate grew desperate even to sublimity. The birth of a son, whose destiny was involved in that of the empire like her own, was perhaps opportune at this dark hour, for it roused all the lioness within her. The mother will dare for her offspring that which she would shrink from for her own sake. The bold and wise resolution of the Empress was taken. By it she at once saved herself and her magnificent realm. History and romance have no more inspiring and memorable story to relate. It is glorious as a dream. The Hungarians, whose struggles in this century have excited universal sympathy, had been relieved from political evils by Maria Theresa, who restored to them their privileges. For this they were deeply grateful to her. She was their queen, in virtue of a previous union of Austria and Hungary by the marriage of their respective sovereigns. In the great emergency of their dominions, therefore, she went to Pressburg to be crowned, it being the custom to repeat the act of coronation in each of the several kingdoms acknowledging one head. The ceremony took place on the 13th of June, 1741. According to the ancient usage, the iron crown of St. Stephen was placed on her, having been lined with cushions to make it fit her womanly head. His ragged and venerated robe covered her jeweled dress, and his scimitar was girded at her side. An eyewitness of the scene writes that, quote, "The antiquated crown received new graces from her head, and the old tattered robe of St. Stephen became her as well as her own habit, if diamonds, pearls, and all sorts of precious stones can be called clothes." End quote. She rode gallantly to the top of the Royal Mount, a hill near Pressburg, and went gracefully through the ceremony of waving the drawn saber and defying the four corners of the world. Then she returned and dined in public. The heat and fatigue had heightened the color of her transparent complexion, the crown was removed, and her rich masses of hair fell in curls over her shoulders and breast. Her appearance, her recent liberal concessions, and her defenseless situation aroused the warmest enthusiasm of the brave and chivalric Hungarians. She knew that she could trust herself and fortunes to their generosity and invincible prowess, and, having summoned the representatives of all orders of the state to meet in diet at the great hall of the castle, she appeared, clad in mourning and the Hungarian costume, and still wearing the crown and scimitar which were regarded by the nation with such religious respect. With slow, stately steps she walked through the apartment and ascended the tribune, from which it was customary for sovereigns to address the states. After an impressive silence, the Chancellor stated her distresses and requested speedy assistance. Then she herself made a short speech in Latin, a language in common use among the Hungarians. She appealed to the deputies, declaring that her only resource was in their faithfulness, arms, and tried valor. She called on them to deliberate as to the best means of rescuing her from danger, and promised always to seek their happiness. Her words and her loveliness set on fire all the admiration and martial spirit of the assembly. They half drew their swords and flung them back in their brazen scabbards with a loud ringing sound, and shouted, "We will consecrate our lives and arms, we will die for our king, Maria Theresa." It was a law that no queen could reign over them, and hence they called her king. She was overcome by this outburst of zeal, and wept for joy and gratitude. Such an evidence of sensibility kindled their enthusiasm almost to madness. They shed tears of sympathy, and wildly gesticulating their resolution, retired and voted abundant supplies of men and money. End of section 15. Of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in September 2010. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 16. Maria Theresa, Part 2. A similar scene occurred when the Duke of Lorraine appeared to take oath, as co-regent of the kingdom. At the conclusion of the act he waved his hand and said, "My blood and life for the Queen and kingdom." At the same moment she held up her infant son. An exulting cry again arose, and the deputies repeated their vow, "We will die for our king and her family, we will die for Maria Theresa." Fair Austria spreads her mournful charms, the Queen, the beauty, sees the world in arms. From hill to hill the beacon's towering blaze spreads wide the hope of plunder and of praise. The fierce Croatian and the wild Hussar, with all the sons of ravage, crowd the war. The coup d'etat of the Empress soon changed the whole face of affairs. Numerous half-savage tribes from the far-off banks of the Save, the Theiss, the Drave, and the Danube sent their wild warriors to rally around her standard. Croats, Pandurs, Sclavonians, Varazdinians, and Tolpaches, as they are called, astonished the eyes of civilized Europe by their ferocious looks and their strange dress, arms, and mode of warfare. The students of Vienna, whose modern representatives were bravely active in the Revolution of 1848, mingled their delicate young faces with the shaggy beards of the Croats and Pandurs. All classes pressed into the army, while the enemies of Maria Theresa became jealous of each other and divided in their councils. Frederick sought peace in view of this turning of the tide of success, yet he was too proud to yield his claim to Silesia. The Empress, having long and heroically resisted this claim, at length ceded to him a part of that province, well knowing that she was not, with all her new supplies, a match for so many powerful enemies on the right hand and the left. The Elector of Bavaria, aided by France, had already seized Bohemia, was crowned King of Prague, and soon after crowned Emperor of Germany, at Frankfort. This was a great offense to Maria Theresa, who wished her husband to be elected to the imperial diadem. And she was speedily avenged. The Austrian army, headed by the Duke of Lorraine, entered the capital of Bavaria as conquerors, the very day that the Elector was crowned at Frankfort. The Austrians, supported by England and Holland, achieved one victory after another. The English king, George II., was himself present at hazardous battles. The semi-civilized Croatians swam rivers, each with his saber in his mouth, and, mounting on each other's shoulders, scaled castle walls. The provinces in Italy were fortified, and the Spanish and French invasions repulsed in that direction. Cardinal Fleury, for 17 years the animating soul of the court of France, died and left his nation without a pilot. The French, besieged at Prague, were weakened by disease and famine, and at last fled to the Rhine, leaving 1,200 men, destroyed by cold and hunger, to mark their track. Through the whole campaign, Maria Theresa issued her orders with great determination and wisdom. Her will seemed to have grown relentless and imperious by the difficulties she had met and overcome. She was vexed exceedingly at the escape of the perfidious French, for whom she had no mercy. She celebrated the evacuation of Prague with public chariot races in imitation of the Greeks, and herself and her sister, habited in appropriate costume, took the reins, among others, and drove adventurously around the course, with flushed faces, erect forms, and streaming robes, to the admiration of all beholders. After the victory of Dettingen, the Empress Queen, returning from a boating excursion, was cheered by the Viennese, who came forth to meet her and crowded the banks of the Danube for 9 miles. She celebrated the event by a Te Deum in the cathedral and joyous festivities. Elated by unexpected success, her ambition and her animosity to the powers that had conspired to crush her at length knew no bounds. She rejected the compromises offered, and meditated nothing less than the complete dismemberment of the French and Prussian territories. But discussion began to prevail among her allies. Frederick, who was always wide awake, guessed her designs, captured Prague, and threatened her capital itself. Bavaria also was again seized by her foes, and Maria Theresa was forced to apply once more to her sympathetic Hungarians. She went to Pressburg, and appealed to their loyalty with still greater effect. Count Palfy, the aged Palatine, erected the great red banner of the kingdom, a signal for a general insurrection, as a general levy of troops was called. 44,000 men took up their march, and 30,000 others were collected in readiness. "This amazing unanimity," writes a man of that day, "of a people so divided amongst themselves, especially in point of religion, could only be effected by the address of Maria Theresa, who seemed to possess one part of the character of Elizabeth of England, that of making every man about her a hero." An ecstasy of zeal prevailed from the highest to the lowest rank of society. The Empress sent a horse, a sword, and a ring to the Palatine. The horse was her own and richly caparisoned, and the saber was studded with diamonds. The tide of war turned again. Bohemia and Bavaria were reconquered, and Charles VII., who had been from the first a puppet emperor in the hands of France, died from chagrin and indigestion, like Charles VI. He enjoined on his son to make no pretensions to the crown. The advice was complied with, and Austria seized the occasion to secure the election of the husband of the Empress, Francis, Duke of Lorraine. He was crowned at Frankfort, October 4th, 1745. Maria Theresa witnessed the ceremony from a balcony, and cried, "Long live the Emperor Francis I!" A general acclamation echoed her words. After this, she visited the army at Heidelberg, numbering 60,000. She met the new emperor at the head of his troops, rode along the lines, saluting each rank with charming grace and majesty, dined under a pavilion, and gave largesse to each soldier. Her husband being thus regularly invested with the imperial dignity, she was henceforth known as the Empress Queen, Germany being the empire, and Hungary and Bohemia the queendoms. But though she had fairly, according to the code of force, won these high titles, she was compelled, out of regard to the Elector of Saxony, who was a constant sufferer in her cause, to resign Silesia to Prussia by a final treaty. This humiliation she had resisted for years, and with an immense expenditure of gold and blood. It was her pride to preserve entire the whole empire. Frederick had been her first assailant. She could not forgive him for opening the general war against her, and she had declared that she would sell her last shift before she would yield 1 inch of Silesia. But in Italy and Holland her foes were triumphing. Marshal Saxe was retrieving the glory of French arms. England was tired of furnishing money to Austria at the rate of £1,000,000 in 1 year, and had, moreover, a rebellion at home to attend to, and thus she was forced to consult prudence. In 1748 a general peace was ratified by the celebrated Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, at which the plenipotentiaries of all the leading powers met. Even then and there Count Kaunitz, acting under the instructions of the indomitable Empress Queen, endeavored to break up the conference, so unwilling was she to lose any territory, while a florin was left in her coffers, or a soldier under her command. As it was, she gave up Silesia, Parma, Placentia, and Guastilla. She now turned her attention to the internal administration of the realm. To be well prepared for any new wars, she adopted a better discipline of the army, founded a military academy at the capital, and inspected the camps and garrisons. The discerning Frederick acknowledged that her power over the hearts of her soldiers was magical, and that the Austrian army, never before so well trained, had been made to achieve successes worthy of a great man. In civil affairs her energy was no less conspicuous than in military. Among many other beneficial measures, she revised the courts of justice, abolished the custom of torture, and carried out a new plan of taxation, by which, after 8 years of war and the surrender of 4 states, the revenues still exceeded those of any former reign by 6 millions of florins. She undertook to civilize the gypsies, who abound more in Hungary and Bohemia than elsewhere, but neither rewards nor punishments could induce that strange race to mingle with others and adopt a stationary and laborious life. The glory of her family and the good of her people seemed to be the animating motives of Maria Theresa in all these reforms and enterprises. She sought advice or information from all quarters, yet would not be dictated to in her plans. Her vigilance and activity were commendable, but were carried to an extreme injurious to her own health and comfort. She rose at 5, breakfasted on a cup of milk coffee, and then attended mass. "The floor of her room was so contrived that it opened by a sliding parquet, and mass was celebrated in the chapel beneath. Thus she assisted at the ceremony without being seen, and with as little trouble and loss of time as possible. She then proceeded to business. Every Tuesday she received the ministers of the different apartments. Other days were set apart for giving audience to foreigners and strangers, who, according to the etiquette of the imperial court, were always presented singly, and received in the private apartments. There were stated days on which the poorest and meanest of her subjects were admitted, almost indiscriminately, and so entire was her confidence in their attachment and her own popularity, that they might whisper to her, or see her alone if they required it. At other times she read memorials, or dictated letters and dispatches, signed papers, etc. At noon her dinner was brought in, consisting of a few dishes served with simplicity, After the death of her husband, she usually dined alone, like Napoleon, to economize time. After dinner she was engaged in public business until 6. After that hour, her daughters were admitted to join her in evening prayer. If they absented themselves, she sent to know if they were indisposed; if not, they were certain of meeting with a reprimand on the following day. At 8:30 or 9 she retired to rest. When she held a drawing-room or an evening circle, she remained till 10 or 11, and sometimes played at cards. Before the death of her husband, she was often present at the masked balls or ridottas, which were given at court during the carnival. Afterwards, these entertainments and the number of fêtes or gala days were gradually diminished in number. On the first day of the year, and on her birthday, she held a public court, at which all the nobility, and civil and military officers, who did not obtain access at other times, crowded to kiss her hand. She continued this custom as long as she could support herself in a chair. Great part of the summer and autumn were spent at Schönbrunn or at Luxembourg. In the gardens of the former palace there was a little shaded alley communicating with her apartments. Here, in the summer days, she was accustomed to walk up and down, or sit for hours together. A box was buckled round her waist, filled with papers and memorials, which she read carefully, noting with her pencil the necessary answers or observations to each. It was the fault, or rather the mistake, of Maria Theresa to give up too much time to the petty details of business. In her government, as in her religion, she sometimes mistook the form for the spirit, and her personal superintendence became more like the vigilance of an inspector general than the enlightened jurisdiction of a sovereign." Her nature, in short, was one of those endowed with an inborn perpetual motion and uninterrupted industry. What she lacked in genius was made up by carefulness and persistence. Francis does not appear to have participated much in his wife's enterprises. He might have felt a humble consciousness of his inferiority to her in governmental capacity, but, more likely, the long delay in his receiving the imperial crown, and his taste for quiet pursuits and pleasures, had confirmed him in habits averse to public business. The love, also, which he and Maria Theresa had entertained for each other from infancy, had made it a second nature for each to yield to the other, without so much as thinking which used the greater authority or influence in their united decisions, without knowing whether, in domestic matters, one, or both, or neither ruled. With a mutually respectful and cordial affection, such a question never arises, and is impossible. A oneness of choice is always realized without dispute. A tender love is the harmonizer of opposite natures and wishes, the solvent of difficulties. If carefully fed with the oil of kindness, and guarded against all the winds of passion, it is a clear flame that fuses the most stubborn and diverse characters into a flowing union that runs smoothly, and is at length cast in one mould. The instance of Maria Theresa and her husband is remarkable. Never were there more or greater proofs of a happy companionship than theirs, notwithstanding her superior position in affairs of state and his infidelity to marriage vows, which was well known to her. Their long and deep-rooted regard apparently led a spirited, intelligent emperor to surrender all political power to his wife, while the virtuous, resolute empress calmly allowed her husband to indulge his licentious propensities as he pleased, provided his purer devotion was still hers. There could be no more extreme and hazardous tests of their mutual sympathy. It effected such a strange compromise of choice and exchange of privilege, as almost to disprove its own existence on the part of both these persons, especially on the part of Francis. Indeed, this solution of the wonder would be inadmissible, were it not that those who wear crowns seem to regard the most iniquitous liberties as innocent in themselves. The emperor had some share in public acts, and might have taken the direction of affairs from one who exhibited undying constancy to him. He was associated with the skillful Khevenhüller in leading several of the Austrian campaigns. But, for the most part, he kept himself in the background. At a grand levee, when the Empress Queen was receiving a crowd that came to pay respect, he slipped away from her presence to a remote corner of the room. Two ladies rose in reverence as he approached, but he said, "Do not mind me. I shall stay here till the court is gone, and then amuse myself with looking at the crowd." One of the ladies replied, "As long as your Imperial Majesty is present, the court will be here." "You mistake," replied he. "The Empress and my children are the court. I am here but as a simple individual." In the latter part of his life, he had an intrigue with the Princess of Auersperg, and squandered a great amount of money and jewels on this fascinating woman, but the Empress treated the princess with careful politeness, and never manifested to any one her knowledge of the commonly reported affair of Francis. Much of his time was given to masques, balls, festivities, and the opera. Through his influence, Vienna became a city of great gaiety and splendor. Much of his attention was shared by his family. To his children he was kind and generous, and they regarded him with enthusiastic affection. He found time, also, amidst all his duties and recreations, to cultivate a love for the fine arts, for natural history and chemistry in particular. This branch of science then included the wild belief in alchemy. Francis spent no little time and money in the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, and in attempts to fuse many small diamonds into a larger one, not knowing that this jewel is combustible, and any persons devoted to these schemes were provided with materials at public expense. But the spendthrift disposition of the Emperor was also turned to good account. His charities were on as liberal a scale as his luxuries and scientific attempts. While her thoughtless and handsome husband was busy with his flirtation, music, and alchemy, Maria Theresa was engaged in carrying on, or preparing for, wars of defense and conquest. After 8 years of compulsory peace, subsequent to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which had terminated 8 years of war, she took a step which resulted in the 7 Years' War, wherein France, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain were united with her against her old enemy, Frederick of Prussia, who was saved from annihilation only by the great aid of England and his own great genius. Before the campaigns of Napoleon, this war was the wonderful one of modern history, in view of its display of skill and courage, its dreadful waste of blood, and its surprising victories. Maria Theresa's long-cherished enmity to the Prussian king was the cause of it. Though worshipped by her people, abundantly blessed in all the relations of life, and naturally of a humane mind, she could not forget the loss of Silesia, the guilt of Frederick as her first foe, and the bitter jests he had more recently uttered concerning herself and her husband's character. His insulting language, which came to her ears, kindled to a flame the suppressed fires of her former mortification, to which every thought of her lost province, everything that reminded her of it, had added fresh fuel for 8 years. There was no way to gratify this revenge, except by an alliance with France, and thus an ungrateful rupture with England, her old and valuable friend. 300 years of implacable hatred between Austria and France were forgotten. The faithless deception and fierce efforts of France towards herself were overlooked. The danger of alienating all her allies by the junction of two great powers was risked. There was no other way to crush Frederick but by clasping hands with perfidious France. And there was no way to do this except by stooping to flatter Madame de Pompadour, the influential but low-born and shameless mistress of Louis XV. Kaunitz, the now confidential and able adviser of the Empress, apologized for suggesting this expedient, but she, the daughter of 100 kings, virtuous, devout, and proud, at once wrote to Pompadour, calling her "my dear friend and cousin." The artifice succeeded. France was soon hand in glove with Austria. End of section 16. 17 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abai in September 2010. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 17, Maria Theresa, Part 3. The Emperor, as soon as the treaty was made known to him in the council at Vienna, struck the table with his hand, declared he would never consent to it, and walked away. His eldest daughter, Marianne, and his eldest son, Joseph, also protested with vehemence. But Maria Theresa soon won over her family to her schemes, and when England, astonished at the incredible news, remonstrated, she stained her pure name with a falsehood, declaring that the treaty had not yet been signed. Little did she foresee, when she thus abused the long-tried friendship of England, resorted to degrading artfulness, and let loose the hounds of a general, protracted, and bloody war, little did she foresee the retribution that followed, especially the deplorable end of her own fair daughter, Marie Antoinette, who, in consequence of this same alliance, afterwards became a Queen of France. The leaders of the Austrian armies were Marshal Daun, a Bohemian, Marshal Loudon, a Scot, and Marshal Lacy, of Irish descent. Francis was intrepid even to rashness. This fact, together with his moderate talents, and her fear of the confusion that might follow his death, may have induced the Empress to dissuade him from taking any command in the ensuing contests, in the course of which Silesia was regained and once more lost, and the vicissitudes of success so great that at one time Vienna was nearly overwhelmed, at another the Prussian sovereign driven from his capital. One of the chief victories on the Austrian side was that of Kolin, June 18, 1757, by which the empire was saved from alarming danger. In gratitude for this deliverance, and in celebration of this triumph, the soldiers were generously rewarded, medals were struck, Te Deums chanted, and the Order of Maria Theresa founded, as a mark of honor to the officers who had distinguished themselves. Nor was the Empress less magnanimous to bravery when unaccompanied by success. At Torgau, the same Marshal Daun, conqueror at Kolin, was defeated in a critical battle after heroically sustaining it, and the Empress showed him unprecedented regard by going forth to meet him on his return to Vienna, and addressing him in words of kind encouragement. Though many thousands fell in many battles, to appease her ambition or resentment, she was still a noble and sympathizing woman whenever adversity appealed to her better feelings. And in this she was unlike the insensible Frederick, who refused to ransom or exchange one of his princely subjects when taken prisoner, or even to notice his letters. Maria Theresa, however, liberated him, without ransom, when he tried to redeem himself. After 7 years' war, Frederick, contending almost single-handed against the three greatest powers of the continent, and many of the smaller ones, was nearly exhausted and overthrown. Such was his despair that he carried poison with him, determined to die rather than be taken prisoner. He, who had despised all women and abused his wife and sisters, was almost crushed at last by the retaliation of two women, the Sovereign of Austria and Elizabeth, Empress of Russia. Against the latter, as against the former, he had spoken sarcastically, though too justly. She retorted with an army of 50,000 men. The two empresses were his mightiest foes, and were just at the point of final triumph, when Peter III, an enthusiastic admirer of Frederick, succeeded to the Russian scepter by the death of Elizabeth, and took the part of Prussia. This event put the contest on a more equal footing again. But all concerned were tired of so protracted bloodshed, and of melting even jewels and church plate into money. An Austrian prisoner assured Frederick that his queen would consent to terms. The king seized a half-sheet of paper, wrote 10 lines of proposed treaty, and dispatched it to Vienna, requiring an immediate reply. Maria Theresa accepted it at once. By this treaty all things were to be as at the commencement of the war. 500,000 men had been slain, Bohemia and Saxony laid waste, Prussia left with hardly a man, and all Europe kept in 7 years' alarm, in order that 2 or 3 crowned heads might settle their personal grievances. Nor were the devastations of the sword and torch confined to Europe. England and France carried their part of the quarrel wherever the possessions of each came into contact. France lost the most of her ground in America and the East and West Indies, together with the best part of her armies, commerce, and treasure, and all these disasters hastened the reign of terror wherein Marie Antoinette lost her head. The Treaty of General Peace was signed in 1763. 2 years afterward, the imperial court journeyed to Innsbruck to attend the marriage of Maria Theresa's second son, the Archduke Leopold, with the Infanta of Spain. Leopold succeeded to his father's duchy of Tuscany, and, being a man of strong mind and good heart, contributed greatly to the reform and prosperity of his state. While at Innsbruck, his father, the Emperor Francis, died. Already ill and with some premonition of his danger, he took leave of his children who remained at Vienna. Marie Antoinette, then 10 years old, was his favorite child, and he kissed and pressed her to his heart a second time. At Innsbruck his wife was alarmed at his symptoms, and urged him to be bled. But he replied in sad jest, "Do you wish to kill me with bleeding?" He was again entreated on Sunday, August 18th, to try the remedy, and said, "I must go to the opera, and I am engaged afterward to sup with Joseph," though it is affirmed that he was really to sup with his paramour, the Princess of Auersperg. But, as he left the opera, he fell dead with apoplexy. Maria Theresa was inconsolable, and the more so, doubtless, on account of her conviction that he was unprepared to die. She wrote the next day to her family in these words, quote, "Alas, my dear daughters, I am unable to comfort you. Our calamity is at its height. You have lost a most incomparable father, and I, a consort, a friend, my heart's joy for 42 years past. Having been brought up together, our hearts and our sentiments were united in the same views. All the misfortunes I have suffered during the last 25 years were softened by his support. I am suffering such deep affliction that nothing but true piety, and you, my dear children, can make me tolerate a life which, during its continuance, shall be spent in acts of devotion." End quote. She could not bear the scene of her affliction, and sailed immediately for her capital, accompanied only by her son, an officer, and a lady attendant. Francis was buried at Vienna, in a family vault, constructed under the Capuchin church, by the order of Maria, when she was but 26 years of age. At every anniversary of her husband's death, during the 15 years that she survived him, she visited his tomb, and engaged in devotions. Through all those years, also, she wore mourning, inhabited plainly furnished rooms, draped with black cloth, and, shunning scenes of gaiety, confined herself to state business and religious observances. At the next court occasion, after the emperor's death, she directed all the ladies to appear in mourning. This order was complied with, except by the Princess of Auersperg, who appeared in a rich dress and highly rouged. The empress drew back her hand in surprise and contempt when the princess offered to kiss it. But, though the frivolous woman never appeared in the royal presence again, Maria Theresa treated her interests with the same scrupulous regard that she had shown when she insisted on the payment of 200,000 florins to the princess, according to an order on the public treasury, written by Francis the day before his death. She did not take the course of conduct prompted by virtuous indignation, but, from first to last, she acted with a lofty magnanimity. In this world of petty jealousies and small resentments, too much admiration cannot be rendered to a high-minded independence. Maria Theresa's retaliations were on a great scale, were either grandly national or nothing. It is wonderful how much she managed to accomplish. She was the mainspring of every enterprise, and attended to everything personally. She necessarily gave much time to the 1,000 forms and ceremonies of her station. She never forgot her many devotional tasks, and she was the mother of 16 children in the course of 20 years. These children were brought up to simple habits, benevolent acts, a proficiency in music and Italian, an empty knowledge of the lives of Romish saints, and an overweening family pride. The incongruous results of such an education were seen in their after lives. Many great or good deeds were mingled with their bigotry in their excessive and sometimes fatal devotion to family interests. Nearly all her sons and daughters who grew to maturity occupied positions of importance. The eldest son, Joseph, succeeded to the German Empire, and displayed great talents, though timid and taciturn in childhood. A younger son, Charles, died at the age of 16. He was bold and brilliant, and his parents treated him with partiality, mistakenly regretting that the government would not fall to him. Joseph first married the Princess of Parma, a dark-eyed Italian of remarkable beauty. She was very melancholy and cold to all persons, from the hour of her marriage. It was supposed that her heart had been given away previously, and this belief has been embodied in a story. She died soon, and Joseph married the Princess of Bavaria, who was as homely as her predecessor was charming, and was treated with cruel neglect by all her husband's family, except the Emperor Francis, at whose death she exclaimed with tears, "Ah, miserable! I have lost my only supporter." Leopold, the next surviving son, has already been mentioned. Ferdinand, the third son, was gentle and beneficent, married the daughter of the Duke of Modena, and inherited that duchy. Maximilian, the youngest son, was Elector of Cologne. The daughters were all gifted, and all beautiful, like their mother, excepting the eldest, Mariana, who was deformed. She and Elizabeth were never married, and lived at home in seclusion, engaged in study, prayer, or deeds of benevolence. Christiana was much like the Empress, who was very partial to her. Her talents were greater, and her determined attachment to her chosen lover equal to her mother's many years before. It is said to have hastened the peace of Hubertsberg. With her husband, Prince Albert of Saxony, she governed Hungary, afterwards the Netherlands, and exercised great influence with her sisters, the Queens of France and Naples. Amelia was surpassingly bright in mind and person, and excelled in amateur dramatic performances. She married the Duke of Parma, and occasioned some trouble by her frivolity. Joanna, affianced to the King of Naples, died of the smallpox. The next sister, Josepha, who was to take her place, died of the same disease. The circumstances were very affecting. She was 15, lovely and tall, with a clear face and long light hair. She was publicly betrothed and treated as a queen already, but she dreaded her destiny. In this state of extreme sensitiveness, she was directed by her mother to visit her father's tomb and pay her last respect to his memory. With many tears she consented, but, while in the vault, was seized with chills and faintness, and the next day was attacked with the smallpox, from which she died, to the great grief of the Empress, who too late lamented her imperious treatment. The next daughter, Caroline, equally intelligent and lovely, finally married the Neapolitan king, whose dullness and amiability easily brought him under the entire control of his cunning wife, and her more cunning and famous coadjutor, Lady Hamilton. Marie Antoinette, the youngest daughter, was the wife and fellow victim of Louis XVI of France. The many family afflictions of Maria Theresa, calmly borne during all her arduous reign, enhance her heroic merits. Her habits of devout meditation and worship, no less than her strong character, enabled her to do and suffer so much. Hers was a most exacting, unnatural, and puerile round of religious ceremonies. She spent the entire month of August in penance and prayer for her husband's departed soul. She gave 5 hours every day to the same monastic occupations, but the spirit of piety may live under any forms, however cumbrous. and if she acted according to her best knowledge, her zeal should provoke respect and admiration. Certainly, if faith is to be judged by its fruits, hers had much that was praiseworthy. She was eminently beneficent and deeply affected by all forms of woe. Meeting some half-famished persons in Vienna, she said, "What have I done that Providence should afflict my eyes with such a sight as this?" Her charities amounted to more than 80,000 a year, says an English writer. Her virtue, however, at length took one shape that was more odious than injurious. From no love of gossip, apparently, but with the idea that her vigilant superintendence and reformatory power should be almost omniscient and omnipotent in her kingdom, she exercised through a multitude of spies a despotic surveillance of the private affairs of families, and any lady of any rank who overstepped the chaste decorum was banished to the limits of the realm. Throughout her dominions she instituted or improved academies, schools, observatories, systems of prizes, regulations for the encouragement of agriculture. She founded a hospital for smallpox and promoted inoculation, for the want of which she herself suffered great disfigurement of her beauty, which was finally obliterated by her obesity and by an accident which mangled her face. She suppressed the Inquisition and the Society of Jesuits, interdicted many of the useless saints' days, and opened the royal parks to common use as a public promenade, now known as the Prater, a magnificent feature of Vienna. But her censorship of the press and prohibition of French and English literature was, to a great extent, very bigoted and oppressive. A book was condemned if, in it, "a doubt was thrown upon the sanctity of some hermit or monk of the Middle Ages, or if it attacked superstition in the slightest degree." The partition of Poland in 1772 is the greatest blot that rests on the reign of Maria Theresa. But her own share in it has many mitigating considerations. The dismemberment was first resolved upon by the Prussian and Russian governments, and Maria Theresa was persuaded by her son Joseph, already clothed with powers equal to hers, and by her chief counsellor Kaunitz, to join in the iniquitous measure, in order to check the ambition of her old rival Frederick. Her consent shows how a spirit of policy may extinguish the liveliest impulses of the heart, for she acted towards Poland as other governments, to her everlasting indignation, had designed to act towards her in the beginning of her reign. Her grandfather and his dominions had been saved from the Turks by the bravery of the Poles a century before, and the portraits of that ancestor and his Polish deliverer were the only ones that graced the room she daily occupied. So inconsistent and ungrateful was that ambition which further persuaded her to consent to another war with Prussia, occasioned by a revival of the Austrian claim to Bohemia. Yet she remonstrated against this step with tears, sent 500 ducats to those who suffered by the ravages of her army, and herself wrote a frank letter to Frederick that terminated the conflict. The two aged enemies now exchanged messages of kindness, and the question was settled by the intervention of Russia, at Maria Theresa's earnest solicitation. She wept for joy at this, and said, "I am overpowered with joy. I do not love Frederick, but I must do him the justice to confess that he has acted nobly and honorably. I am inexpressibly happy to spare the effusion of so much blood." These were among the last acts of her life. She had knelt in prayer that God would avert that war, while her armies, led by her son, were passing forth before her windows, with music and flying banners. Now she publicly returned thanks in the church of the Capuchins for the success of her prayers. It was a fit prelude for her approaching and serene, though painful death. She is described at this period, "as an old lady, immensely corpulent, habited in the deepest weeds, with her gray hair slightly powdered, and turned back under a cap of black crepe." Notwithstanding her many infirmities, her deportment was still dignified, her manner graceful as well as gracious, and her countenance benign. The disorder from which she suffered was a dropsy, accompanied by an induration of the lungs, which brought on fits of suffocation, and at length terminated her existence." Such in her last days was the woman who, in the flush of beauty and vigor of youth, had roused the wild admiration of the Hungarians, and so played upon the strings of those noble hearts that the music of 1,000 sabres rattling in their scabbards rang through the royal halls of Pressburg. The distresses of her sickness were intolerable, yet she endured them with fortitude and patience. Once she said, "God grant that these sufferings may soon terminate, for otherwise I know not if I can much longer endure them." She entreated her son not to weep in her presence, lest sympathy for him would take away her firmness. To his care she affectionately bequeathed her children, as all of hers that did not already of right belong to him, her successor. Until the evening before her death she was busy signing papers and giving him parting advice. When he exhorted her to take repose, she replied, "In a few hours I shall appear before the judgment seat of God, and would you have me sleep?" Remembering her plans of charity, her words were, "If I could wish for immortality on earth, it would only be for the power of relieving the distressed." Just before her last breath, someone whispered, "The Empress sleeps." She opened her eyes and said, "I do not sleep. I wish to meet my death awake." Heroic and memorable words. Her whole people, as well as family, were plunged into sorrow by her death, and for many years her subjects often spoke of their mother, as they affectionately termed one who had tenderly cared for their comfort up to the day of her death, November 29th, 1780. She lived to the age of 63 years, 6 months, and reigned 40 years. Her career has but one rival in splendor in the history of crowned women. Its glory is dimmed only by the bloodthirst and intolerance of her period, and of her family indeed, down to this hour. Never was more accomplished by the life of any female, whether for good or evil. In a private sphere she would have left an example worthy of imitation in all respects. As a queen in a freer and enlightened land, not a breath would have sullied the glorious mirror of her character. End of section 17.